Right, so I'm going to start by introducing our first speaker, Joita Das. And while I do that, Joita, feel free to share your screen.
Sure.
So Joita Das is a PhD candidate in the Comparative Asian Studies program at the National University of Singapore. She is the recipient of the NUS Research Scholarship. She completed her BA honours from Azim Premji University in Bangalore and her MA from the Indian Institute of Technology in Gandhinagar, where she was awarded the President's Gold Medal and the Institute Gold Medal. Her doctoral research explores trends in Chinese migratory history in Asia within the larger framework of inter-Asia studies and connected histories, with a special focus on the Indian Chinese community of Calcutta. And today we're going to hear a really fascinating presentation on food infusion in the making of the Indian Chinese community of Calcutta. So whenever you're ready, Joyita, please take it away.
All right, am I audible? Should be fine. All right, so thank you, everyone. So I hear that I have around 20 minutes, so I'll just set a quick timer. And please feel free to just give me a shout out if I'm exceeding my time. So hello, everyone. So as Ashley sort of mentioned, I'm Joita. I'm a PhD student from the Comparative Asia Studies program at the National University of Singapore. I would also first like to start by thanking the organizers of this particular seminar for extending the invitation to come and present. I'm very excited about it. And I'd also like to preface this presentation by saying that I'm not a food studies expert. I'm not a food historian. So my approach to this discussion is really going to be from the perspective of the community and what my interviews and my field work have shown about the relationship between food and community identity. So I'm looking at this very small, almost a sort of 5,000 member strong Indian Chinese community who are currently residing in Calcutta, which is in eastern India. It was also the former capital of colonial India. And it also incidentally is my hometown. My academic interests lie right now within the broader discipline of area and Asia studies. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I do think that food offers us a compelling lens through which we can sort of challenge disciplinary boundaries, particularly with regards to how we think about area and regional histories, which is really where my sort of disciplinary leanings are. So I've titled this presentation Cha, Chini, and Cheena Bazaar, Food and Fusion in the Making of the Indian Chinese Community. I don't think there's anyone here who's too familiar with Bengali, but for anyone who might be familiar with language, and who may be familiar with Bengali, they'll sort of realize Bengali is the regional language spoken in Calcutta, by the way. So they'll realize that some of these words are actually quite familiar. So for example, the word cha, which is the first word in the title of my presentation, cha means tea in Bengali. But incidentally, chai means tea in Hindi. But incidentally, the word cha also means tea in Chinese, which is actually from where both the Bengali and Hindi words originate. So similarly, the word chini in Bengali means sugar, but it is also associated with the Chinese, who are referred to as Chini because of the historical association with sugar production. And Cheena Bazaar is Chinatown. So even the title itself reflects this very long-standing history of India-China connections through food. So examining the Indian Chinese community in some ways is really an attempt to look at these historical and cultural connections that have existed between India and China. So with that rather long introduction, let me then sort of begin my presentation. And I think I would like to start by talking a little bit about myself and the motivations I have for doing the kind of research that I do. As I said, my family is from this city in eastern India, Calcutta, the former colonial capital of British India. But I didn't actually grow up there. Still, for most of my life, I found myself calling it my hometown. And perhaps this was slightly misleading because I think I've always felt very disconnected from this city in which I had never lived. But eventually, I sort of learned that what really connected me to Calcutta was food. And this was food that was being cooked at home or that we would eat as a family when we went out. And perhaps slightly ironically, it was Chinese food that helped sort of connect me and bridge the gap between me and my hometown. So it wasn't really Indian food or Bengali food, it was Chinese food, which originated with the Chinese migrants in Calcutta and then subsequently spread to other parts of India. It was that food that helped me sort of connect to Calcutta. So that was really what got me interested in the Chinese community um, of Calcutta, which has become the subject of my doctoral research for the past couple of years. So Indian Chinese food, of course, influenced Calcutta's cultural fabric in very significant ways. So much so that the cuisine is pretty much a staple in Calcutta today, and dare I say, it almost has national appeal. Um, so then, what exactly is Indian Chinese food? And put very simply, it is first and foremost Chinese food with Indian elements. For example, Indian Chinese food tends to be slightly on the saltier side. It tends to have certain spices that are not typical in Chinese cooking, but are more typical in Indian cooking, but then got incorporated very easily in the Chinese sort of culinary techniques among Chinese migrants in Calcutta. The use of paneer, which is cottage cheese, instead of tofu, is also common. Vegetables like green chilies or bell peppers, which might not be traditionally used in Chinese cooking, also got incorporated in Indian Chinese cuisine relatively easily as migrants sought to reproduce their food and culinary heritage in a foreign land. Today, of course, you have a wide range of eating establishments serving Indian Chinese food, from very high-end restaurants to street-side hawker centers. And some of these places are still run by members of the Indian Chinese community. But increasingly, it's local Bengalis who've sort of taken up the baton, so to speak, in making and serving Indian Chinese food, which includes things like Hakka noodles and chili chicken. So what follows then for the rest of the presentation are specific case studies that I've identified in the form of archival documents and interviews that I conducted last year with members of the Indian Chinese community, many of whom are actually chefs and restaurant owners. And the central question that was really guiding some of these interviews and this broader presentation is really in what ways does food intersect with community identity? So that's really the overarching lens through which I'm looking at some of these primary sources. So with that, let me begin with my first case study. And what you see on the right-hand side there is an excerpt from a newspaper from 1939, written by someone who appears to have been a European traveler to Calcutta in the 1930s. And the article is one of the earliest descriptions of Calcutta's Chinatown. So you can see in this article how descriptions of food have been used as markers to denote an ethnic space. So let me just sort of read a little bit of the article there. It says that Chinatown had innumerable eating houses with their distinctive odors, and that the big restaurants were always well patronized, the dishes varying from shark's fin and bird's nest soup to fried rice. So thus, even in the earliest descriptions of Chinatown, food was emphasized as a very defining characteristic of ethnic minority spaces and Chinese spaces especially. So the context of the rest of the article, which we don't have time to get into right now, but essentially the rest of the article is plagued with very Orientalist imagery of a very dark and mysterious Chinatown. And we can see in that context how food continues to play a role in sort of further exoticizing the Chinese community within the city. So dishes like shark's fin soup definitely would not have been common in the broader culinary landscape of Calcutta. So by highlighting these foods in sort of ethnographic descriptions of Chinatown and of Calcutta, writers often tended to orientalize Chinatown and orientalize Chinese spaces and therefore the Chinese community. Having said that, two of the oldest Chinese restaurants in Calcutta were established in the 1920s. One was called Ocho and the other was called Nanking, neither of which are operational today. But at one time, these restaurants were patronized by the very, very wealthy and the very, very elite. These restaurants were established for the Chinese community in the 1920s. In fact, I recently learned that Ocho actually comes from the Chinese word Ozhou, which means Europe, which already indicates and hints at the kind of clientele that might have dined in these very early Chinese restaurants back in the day, and the kind of clientele the Chinese owners would have wanted to come to their establishments. The photo that you see over there of the Nanking restaurant, established in 1924, I believe, but it's no longer operational. So you see this fascinating contradiction here, where you have early ethnographies often depicting very orientalized images of Calcutta's Chinatown through food. Yet the colonial and European elite were among the most enthusiastic patrons of Chinese food during those early years. So it was not the popularity of these restaurants among the Chinese alone, but rather the appeal to the British and local Bengalis, which I'll get to later, that allowed Chinese restaurants to flourish in Calcutta through much of the 20th century. And that is something that becomes apparent even in more sort of contemporary narratives about Chinese food in the city as well. It becomes apparent, especially in some of the interviews that I did with members of the community. So that sort of brings me to the next case study, which is on this relatively well-established company in Calcutta called Po Chong. So Po Chong is a Chinese sauce and condiment manufacturing company owned by an Indian Chinese family, and their story is sort of very well known in Calcutta. So Po Chong uh, and their sauces in many ways pioneered what we understand to be Indian Chinese cuisine today, and they pioneered it all the way back in the early 1900s. So I had the opportunity to actually interview members from within this company who were able to tell me a little bit about this particular family's history and their pioneering role in creating Indian Chinese food. So Po Chong was founded in 1958 by the current CEO's great-grandfather, a man by the name of Li Shuchuan, who came to Calcutta from China around the 1930s. And Li, of course, had no knowledge of cooking or of food. He was actually a herbal doctor. He had come to Calcutta drawn by a sort of widespread belief among many Chinese at the time that Calcutta was a city paved with gold. So this perception stemmed largely from the city's status under British colonial rule, which gave it an image of prosperity and opportunity. So that is really what drew Li and other Chinese men, mostly bachelors, to Calcutta in the early 1900s. But upon arriving in Calcutta, Li soon found out that, funnily enough, he found Indian food to be very bland, which is quite ironic considering Indian food is often considered quite spicy and often very flavorful. But anyway, he found it very bland, and he decided, because he had a deep interest in the medicinal properties of herbs and spices, because he was a herbal doctor, it sort of sparked an idea in him, and he sort of began experimenting and eventually created the green chili sauce made from green chilies, which were being grown abundantly in Calcutta around this particular time. So Li then began using his green chili sauce in Chinese cooking, which again wasn't customary. But eventually, this led to the sauce becoming a key ingredient in Chinese cooking, as other migrants around him also started adopting and taking up his sauce in their cooking and culinary practices as well. So while traditionally green chilies were not that common in Chinese cooking, because it was grown so abundantly in India, Li was able to incorporate that in his sauce. And of course, the cultural familiarity of green chilies made the sauce a natural addition to local Bengali meals as well. And today it is served alongside kebabs and wraps, other than its use in, of course, Chinese cooking. So that's what you see in the photograph there. So overall, this is a broader appeal of Chinese food and Chinese cooking was not just limited to the Chinese community, but because it had such broad appeal to the Europeans, to the local Bengalis, that is perhaps what contributed to the long-term success and sustainability of Indian Chinese cuisine. So that's sort of my second case study. My next case study is sort of another interview that I did with another Chinese Indian restaurant owner, a chef, this time a woman. She has a very similar story in that her ancestors also came from southern China to Calcutta in the early 1900s. But interestingly, her relationship, she's a chef, but her relationship with food is actually quite dark and perhaps a little sad. So her story, um, this is essentially a story of this young woman who grows up in the 1950s in town near Calcutta. And her parents own this very small dumpling stall. That's how they made a living. And she learns how to cook and make dumplings and other Chinese food from her mother, who would sell these dumplings on the streets of the town where she lived. However, in 1962, there was the Great India-China War, which was, of course, a major event in India's post-colonial history. So not a lot of people actually know about this, but during the war, the Indian government actually forcibly interned in concentration camps thousands of members of the Chinese community in India, including those who had Indian citizenship, like my interviewee. She was interned in the camp with her family. And the book that you see on the slide is actually a collection of first-hand accounts of internees who were in the camp. And it was during this internment that my interviewee told me that she understood what real hunger means. That's sort of her quote. So for a community whose history is so deeply intertwined with food, the irony isn't sort of lost here, right? That she whose family once ran this food stall and who would then later go on to open some of Calcutta's most successful Chinese restaurants, that she had to endure so much hardship, hunger, and starvation in those particular camps. So someone whose life was dedicated to nourishing others was herself deprived of food during her internment years. So it's a very powerful imagery, and perhaps a very heartbreaking irony. So when you compare her legacy through her restaurants, and when you compare that to her own experiences of war, starvation, hunger, um, and persecution, you sort of realize the incredible strength of not just her, but of a community at large. So my interviewee was in the concentration camp for around 5 years, and then when she was released, she sort of followed in her parents' footsteps and went on to open several Chinese restaurants in Calcutta, all very well established now, including that one. So then what do these interviews show? So first, they reveal the Chinese community's remarkable resilience, and of course, incredibly enterprising attitude and willingness to adapt to the local Bengali environment through food. They also underscore the fusion of Indian and Chinese ingredients, leading to the emergence of a distinct hybrid cuisine, and this culinary blending perhaps mirrors the community's own hybrid identity existing in this sort of interstitial space between being both Indian and Chinese. And finally, there's a deeply personal and intimate relationship that members of the community have with food, ranging from the celebratory, like Po Chong's very inventive spirit, to the heart-wrenching, as seen in my interview stories of hunger and starvation. So food remains very central here to both personal and community identity and history. And the final case study I want to talk about takes us in sort of a slightly different direction, but still continuing on with this theme of cultural syncretism through food. I had the opportunity during my fieldwork, to visit this rather interesting site in Calcutta's Chinatown, which is the Chinese Kali temple. Kali is a Hindu goddess. She's often revered as the Hindu goddess of death and time. And what's really interesting is that the Chinese community seem to have adopted her worship. The Chinese community in Calcutta are not Hindus, but somewhere in their history and settlement in the city, they seem to have adopted Kali as their own, and dedicated a temple to her honor in Chinatown. And what's really interesting in their worship of this Hindu deity is they actually combine Hindu and Chinese ritual practices in their worship of this deity, which includes serving things like noodles as religious offering. So in Hindu custom, it's usually more customary for to be served sweets as a religious offering, but in this particular temple, it's customary to serve noodles during major festivals instead of the usual sweets. Um, so the practice of Kali worship among the Chinese in Calcutta reveals the persistence of a Chinese cultural identity in a transnational context, one that finds expression through food, while also engaging with and adapting to Hindu, or perhaps more accurately, Bengali, Indian and Bengali modes of worship. And this photo here is also from inside another Chinese temple. So I sat down for a meal with some of the devotees of this temple, and you can see here an interesting assortment of both Chinese and local Bengali dishes being served. So you have aloo dum, which is a potato curry dish, being served alongside dal, which is a lentil curry dish, but then it's being served alongside tofu, which is not customary in Bengali cuisine, at least. So what do these instances really show, right? So when members of the Indian community, the Chinese community, worship a Hindu deity using Chinese food as a religious offering, it represents an effort by the community to integrate and bring some of their own cultural identity into that sacred space, adopting and perhaps even appropriating it, which leads to the expression of a hybrid identity. So what becomes apparent here again is this link between food and community identity. So that's about the end of my presentation. Just a few concluding remarks. I think I would like to end my presentation by commenting a little bit on what I think all of this, what kind of bearing I think all of these case studies have on the broader field of Asia studies, which is from where I'll be situating my work ultimately. So there has been in recent years a shift in the field of Asia studies where scholars are realizing that increasingly pigeonholing Asia into regions like Southeast Asia or South Asia or China for academic inquiry risks blinding scholars to the connected histories of these spaces. So the study of food like Indian Chinese cuisine challenges these ideas about pure national or regional cuisines and shows instead how food evolves when people migrate and adapt. So, studying Indian Chinese cuisine offers a particularly rich lens for exploring these dynamics as it naturally lends itself to the analysis of hybrid identities. Through food, we can see and trace the cultural adaptations and shared histories that define these cross cultural encounters between the overseas Chinese in India and other communities like the Europeans, the British, and the Bengalis, of which they were a part. Finally, rather than sort of thinking of Indian Chinese food as being a perversion of Indian food or of Chinese food, so rather than thinking of it as being inauthentic, it is important to see this cuisine as an example of how new cultural forms are born through migration, adaptation, and creativity across Asia. And this in turn will help provide new sites for expanding comparative research within and beyond Asia studies. So that's where I'm sort of taking these case studies finally. All right, so with that, I will end my presentation. That's it from my side. Thank you so much for listening. And I suppose over to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Joita. That was really, really, really interesting. So much to think about, and I'm especially fascinated by the Chinese Kali temple. That's so, so strange, so wonderful. Just a quick note for anyone, if you do want to find out more about or learn more about this green chili sauce, Joita has written a really interesting article on that, which I will put in the chat in a second. But we will move on, as I said, now to Nan, and we'll save questions for the end of the day. So let me introduce Nan, and while I do that, feel free to share your screen. Nanjiang has a background in historical geography and worked as a book editor before joining the food studies community. Last October, he earned his master's degree in gastronomy and food studies from the Technological University of Dublin, where he completed a project on the upward mobility of Chinese restaurants in Dublin. He is now doing archival research in Ireland's Chinese restaurants, and this September he will hopefully begin his PhD program, which will use more ethnographic methods to explore the intersection of food, migration, and identity. And today we will be hearing about that very master's degree project. So take it away, Nan, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for coming. I'm very excited to share this research with you. So I started this project in the spring of last year when I was a grad student at TU Dublin and studying gastronomy and food studies. I gathered material mainly through face-to-face interviews with restaurateurs, for writers, and searching the archives of two major Irish newspapers, the Irish Times and the Irish Independent. This research is the first step of my exploration of the globalization of Chinese food or food in general. My topic of discussion today is about the social mobility of Chinese restaurants in Dublin. So specifically, how do they pursue distinction in terms of culinary prestige? So if you travel to Ireland, you will immediately notice the ubiquity of Chinese eateries. Almost every town and the city has Chinese restaurants or takeaways, even though the Chinese population in Ireland is very small. So it's about 50,000 people. And these establishments are various in their food, in their decor and staff, you can see from the pics. However, rather than being associated with good quality or fine dining, and Chinese food is usually seen as a cheap or convenient alternative to home cooking or formal dining out. An example of this is the very popular Spice Bank, and it is a fast food and contains deep fried chips and chicken and vegetables and seasoned with salt, chili, and spices, and served in a paper bag. I think it's the origin of this name. And it is invented by a Chinese takeaway in Templo, Dublin in 2010. And now you can also get this much bigger spice box, which contains deep fried spare ribs, chicken balls, and wings. So for many people, Spice Bank represents Irish and Chinese food, but the restaurateurs I interviewed don't think so. So the first Chinese restaurants in Dublin can be traced back to the late 1950s. And they were opened by Chinese immigrants from Shanghai, Canton, Hong Kong, and Malaysia. And they catered mainly to Irish customers, as the Chinese population at that time is very small. So it's difficult to give details of their food because there's no more information about it. But as far as I know, their food was certainly more authentic than the later periods, because these people, they still maintain their own way of cooking. It seems that the novelty of this Chinese food didn't appeal to the Irish palate for long, because in the 1960s, about half of these earliest Chinese restaurants, they had to close their doors, and the rest changed their menus to include more European dishes or westernized food, such as curry. So it's not Indian curry. It's it's like more like British curry, and the 1970s saw the spread of these Chinese restaurants from Dublin city center to suburbs, and also the dominance of Cantonese cuisine, because most Chinese people in Ireland during that time were Cantonese from Hong Kong. And also the emergence of Chinese takeaways. I think this is influenced by Britain. And the 1980s and the 90s was the first golden age of Chinese restaurant. This is symbolized by the establishment of some restaurant groups. So you have many Wangs, many Kingsland distributed in different areas. The introduction of Sichuan cuisine to Ireland through the cooperation between the Irish Chinese restaurateurs and the government of mainland China. Before 2000, as I mentioned before, most restaurateurs are immigrants from Hong Kong. But since then, influenced by China's economic reform, so that time, many people in Dongbei, so northeastern China, they became unemployed, so they came to Ireland to find opportunities of work or study. And these people, they opened many small, humble ethnic eateries in Dublin city center. They're serving cheap and spicy regional cuisines. And the recession between 2009 and 2013 badly hit the catering industry, and many old Chinese restaurants had to close their doors. But the takeaway and these more ethnic restaurants, they did very well. So they survived. And since 2013, with the recovery of the economy, and new style and high-end Chinese restaurants have stepped on the stage, and their owners are, very diverse. There are second-generation Irish Chinese. We'll see new immigrants from mainland China, and also Irish natives who love eating and cooking Chinese food. So my focus is on the latest development, so the latest stage of the history. And the framework of my research is based on Pierre Bourdieu's theory of cultural capital. So in the context of the restaurant industry, cultural capital can be understood as both the legitimate taste determined by taste makers and the consciousness and techniques for producing food that embodies that taste. So first, it is through the practice of food production, these abstract ideas such as authenticity, originality, or flavor can be perceived and experienced and tasted by the customers and by food critics. And the second, I think cooking has the aspects that beyond the structuring effects of habitus. So these restaurateurs and the chefs, they can create or improvise during their work. So it is not owning the cultural capital or habitus. In my interview data, I identified 7 strategies this restaurateur used for acquiring and maintaining the 2 forms of cultural capital to achieve distinction. So as to the legitimate taste, so it is a more abstract aspect of the cultural capital. These restaurateurs, they use their languages or their words to claim the authenticity and the modernity of their products in contrast to those of other restaurants, which they perceived inauthentic or traditional. So here I give you some examples to show how the rest 6 practical strategies work. The first, you can see this is a famous Sichuan dish, 夫妻肺片 or husband and wife lamb pieces. So on the left is a more traditional version of it. It consists of slices of beef offal and seasoned with chili oil and coriander. In the middle, it has a new presentation and in the glass plate. So this is a novel restaurant, but the ingredients don't change much. On the right, it becomes a new dish. The offal is replaced by beef because of the eating habits of the Irish customer, and also it is cooked sous vide. So it becomes a new dish, but the flavor still remains the same because they use the same condiments as the traditional dish. And the second example is char siu. So it is a classic Cantonese dish. And the left one, so you can see this part is char siu. So others are like barbecue ducks and porks. Char siu, this one is more traditional way of cook it. So it is cooked well done, and they use this plum sauce dip or soy sauce. And the right one is cooked medium rare. So you can see the pink color of the meat. And also the dip is changed from plum sauce to egg. So it is a more Japanese way of eating it. But it is still, the chef and the restaurateur still recognized it as a Chinese dish because they think the flavor is authentic. And I tested it. I think, yeah, it is. And from this picture, you can see this is a very stylish restaurant in Dublin named Hang Dai. And from the picture, you can see both the visual and the acoustic design of it. So there's a DJ stage and a cocktail bar over there. And you can see the decor is very very chic, and also it mimics the subway carriage of maybe Beijing or Shanghai's metro system. And also you can see from the text, the restaurant has a very complex sound system that makes it unique. And the next one is more fine dining. So its name is China Sichuan. And you can see from the tableware and the waiter that their service style is very westernized. So but it still serves very authentic traditional Sichuan cuisine. So it's very interesting. And another interesting thing is the restaurateurs, they are still learning from other restaurants in Western culinary centers and China. So they have these learning journeys to London, New York, Shanghai, Beijing, Hong Kong, or Taipei. And this picture is a journey of the restaurant staff of China's return to London and organized by the owner. So from this empirical studies, I came to my three major arguments. So I think it's very similar to Joita's because we share the same idea of this, the fluidity of identity. So first, I think if you see ethnic authenticity as a thing constructed in practice rather than embodied by the ethnic groups. So the people, like the Indian people or the Irish people, both of them can cook a very authentic Chinese food. So Chinese food is not, it is not a thing exclusively belong to the Chinese people. So the Chineseness of food, I think it is stretchable. The second is, I think, the cultural capital understood as legitimate. I think it is dynamic. It is not a thing there and cannot be contexted. These restaurateurs are interviewed. They reinterpreted it in their practice, and also they contextualized it in their specific conditions. So they incorporate their cultural backgrounds, their personal biographies into their food, and they explain or they present the authenticity, the innovation of food in different ways. And I think also, as a very small case in Dublin, it also shows the cultural globalization now is in a new stage. So it is more fragmented. So the direction of globalization is not merely from east to west or west to east. It is very complex, have multiple directions. And also, I think authenticity is losing its national roots. So I think this is a good phenomenon, and it is gradually replaced by hybridization of these different culinary traditions. That's all. I have to stop here, and I'd love to hear from you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nan. That was, again, another really fascinating presentation. And I think more than any other seminar I've done, it has made me so hungry. So well done.
Yeah, it's meal time.
Again, similarly, I think you have written down your work in a published article, so I'm going to put that in the chat if anyone wants to have a look at more detailed findings. It's a really, really fun article. Okay, let me end the recording here.